The following podcast may be disturbing to those who support hatred, terrorism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of How We Fought Against, where we have a very special guest. Izabella Tabarovsky is a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, oversees the Institute's historical memory research and programming, manages both its Russian file and its Focus Ukraine blogs, coordinates its US-Israel working group on Russia and the Middle East. She's an expert in the politics of historical memory in the post-communist space, the Holocaust, Stalin's repression, Soviet Jewry, and contemporary left anti-Semitism, and is of course published widely and a contributing writer at Tablet magazine. And now I can take a breath. Izabella, welcome. It's great to have you on the episode.
Great to be here. Thank you, Asher.
Wow. Okay, so obviously you have a very impressive resume, but more than that, you have a very impressive personal story. And before we begin this episode, we're going to talk about everything and anything from modern anti-Semitism to the fight against the USSR's level of anti-Semitism, to Durban 2021, the rise in anti-Semitic incidents online, everything and anything. Let's talk a little bit about you. Besides your bio, which as I said is very impressive, please tell our guests, our viewers, our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I was born in 1970 in the Soviet Union, and I know that I date myself, but I have long stopped being embarrassed about it because I feel like I need to tell people that I actually grew up in the Soviet Union. I wasn't brought to America as a child. I actually experienced that system. We left in 1989. I was born and lived most of my life in Novosibirsk, which is a city in Western Siberia. And we lived in a suburb of Novosibirsk, a scientific suburb, which revolved around a university. There were a lot of research institutes there. It was very heavily Jewish, but as people might know, we didn't have synagogues. We didn't have anything that could mark yourself as culturally or religiously Jewish, but we all knew that we were Jews, because it was an ethnic definition in the Soviet Union. And Soviet Jews would often say, what else could I be with my face? It's like everybody knew that I was a Jew. And this is something I would have said as well. In the Soviet Union, looking the way I do, anybody would have identified me as a Jew. I didn't have to wear any special clothing. I didn't have to wear Magen David, everybody would just know. And that determined some of my experiences, just like it did some of the experiences of the majority of Soviet Jews of my generation and the preceding generations.
All right, perfect. I mean, it's obviously like something that you especially for the new generation, it's something that's important to remember, that there was something like the USSR and that Jews in the USSR not only suffered, but also fought back. And I think that's something that I want to focus on today. And unfortunately, the anti-Semitism is on the rise worldwide. And it's not something I need to tell you, and it's not something that, is new. But anti-Semitism now and anti-Semitism in the USSR, you growing up there, your family coming from there, could you tell our listeners or our viewers a personal story, maybe something that you had to deal with while you were there? Because I think that will give us a good base to the rest of today's conversation.
Sure. Well, I have, first of all, I should probably say that, for me, when I think about it, the story of anti-Semitism encompasses for me, not just my experiences, but the experiences of my family as well, which I'm not going to talk about today, but in my own life. So there are several instances of kind of street level anti-Semitism that I remember, and I've written about them. But one story that I don't think I've written about yet was my experience of trying to get into a college at the age of 17 in Moscow. I wanted to study in Moscow. And it was an experience that really kind of firmly finalized our decision that was it, we were emigrating. So I wanted to get into a college, which was already my third level choice, because my first two choices, I was told, don't even try there. They don't take Jews in those institutions. So I apply for this school and I get really high entrance grades, entrance examination grades. Like I'm literally in the top 5 of students who applied. And yet when they publish the list of those admitted, I'm not on the list of those who are admitted. And so we start investigating. My dad goes and starts to talk to them. They give him some bullshit excuse, which he quickly understands is bullshit. They say that, well, you're not from Moscow, you don't have residence permit, you can't be admitted, which is not true. If this were the policy, they wouldn't have even allowed us to apply. So he starts going through, various levels of bureaucracy, party bureaucracy. This is 1987, it's perestroika, but it's still Soviet times. And he just gets sort of booted out of everywhere. And then at some point he realizes that maybe during perestroika, the press was already empowered quite a bit. It was actually empowered from the top and was allowed to criticize the system. So my dad reads some item in a major newspaper that criticizes the higher education. And he goes and finds the journalist and he says, look, this is what happened to my daughter. I believe that they're not taking her because of anti-Semitism, because she got really high grades. And the journalist tells him, look, go back to them and tell them that if they don't admit your daughter, they're going to read about themselves in our newspaper. So he goes back and I'm immediately admitted. And it was the kind of thing that it was very clear that, okay, it's a victory, but it's a kind of victory where, wow, okay, what happens next time? Like what happens next time if my dad is not there to defend me or to fight for me, right? If a system is this way, if it's set up this way, that as a Jew, I can't even apply to some universities. And then when I apply to one of them, I'm not admitted despite my high entrance grades. What is this? What kind of future can there be for me in this country? And that was a critical moment in our family's history where we decided to emigrate, and 2 years later we did.
Well, I mean, in hindsight, I'm sure that all 3 of those universities, missed out on an excellent scholar, and their loss is everyone else's gain. But you bring up an interesting point, and that kind of is something that I want to carry on to. You said that the system in the USSR was like that. Your question was, if the system's like that, why do we have to stay? Now, the Soviet Union basically created an ideological foundation of an anti-Zionist movement. I don't know if many people realize this, but this is where you saw that core being built. And I'd like to ask you, your opinion on this. Is this something that you concede with? Is this something that you obviously agree with? And also, 2021, thank God there's no more USSR, there's no more Soviet Union, but we're still seeing this anti-Zionist movement. Where do you think that has gone today? If we don't have the Soviets leading, unfortunately their hateful baby, if I can call it that, is still living and kicking despite our best efforts, and we're going to continue with those best efforts. But who took that movement and sort of continued it to 2021?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. This movement does take its roots in Soviet propaganda. I've written about it extensively. The Soviets were the ones who kind of developed some of the main thesis of what we're hearing today. Zionism is racism, comparing Zionists to Nazis, comparing Zionists to fascists. All of it, if you go back and read some of the Soviet literature, and there's plenty of this literature, plenty. That goes back to 67 for sure, probably even before then. 67 was the year when this campaign really went big and went international. One reason for that was that the 6-Day War happened and the Soviet Arab kind of protege countries, client states, lost completely unexpectedly for the Soviets. And the Soviets began to believe that there is an international conspiracy that's operating against them, a Zionist conspiracy, an imperialist conspiracy. Jews and Zionists are working together with Americans. They're trying to bring down the Soviet state and the communist system. So that begins. And there's absolutely nothing that today's anti-Zionists say that I, as a Soviet Jew, either did not hear or cannot find in Soviet literature. Again, going back 50, 60, 70 years even. But the question of how and why it got picked up today, that I think is the most intriguing question. And to that, we don't really have an answer. We can speculate. I believe some scholars trace kind of the resurrection of this propaganda because it subsided completely when the Soviet Union fell apart, which only shows you that the Soviet Union was the one that drove it. It had a massive international propaganda apparatus. It built relationships with left-wing parties in the West, obviously had close relationships with the developing world, fostered those relationships. One of the beneficiaries of that relationship was, in fact, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, who defended his dissertation in Moscow. The title of his dissertation was essentially the comparison between Zionism and Nazism. It was essentially kind of continuing the Soviet line of thinking. So it subsides around 1991 or something like that. And it's interesting that the post-Soviet states essentially all have a very good and positive relationship with Israel. And they, in fact, support Israel in many ways. But then it gets resurrected. And some scholars have tracked the resurrection to Durban. And I believe them. I don't have anything, it's quite possible that that is when it got resurrected. The question is why and how. I can only speculate. Again, I emphasize this is speculation. But the Soviets produced so much of this material and worked so closely with the Palestinians, for example, with Arab states. Of course, we know that the far left today is close to the Palestinians. So it could be that somebody just put out that big library of those materials and began to promote it. I don't know. I mean, I think the level at which it is going, the way it's so massively kind of being promoted in America and in the UK, it does feel like that there is a really concerted effort, but I don't exclude the point that it might simply be the real belief on the far left, and they're learning from one another and picking up the same ideas.
You mentioned Durban, so it's coming up, and let's talk about it. For those of our listeners, our viewers who don't know, 2001, Durban, South Africa, the UN conference was held in order to bring the international community together to present a global front in the fight against racism. What actually happened and what we saw happening is this conference became an unhinged display of Jew hatred, of anti-Semitism, gave rise to the modern BDS movement, and a pervasive discourse and vilification of Israel, that's one that we're seeing around the world today. This is basically, as you said, as some scholars say, the re-rising of the anti-Israel movement. And we're going to see Durban 4 is coming up. We at the ILF are working extremely hard as our partners worldwide to get as many countries to pull out as possible, because this can't be something that's allowed to happen again, but it is, and it's happened again. And this is Durban 4, which means since Durban 1, there've been other conferences. There was the conference in Geneva where we saw Iran, very well known for their human rights and being very nice people being represented. What do you think about this? Where this constant reiteration of it, it's not like this, these concepts don't seem to die. These hateful, so started with the Soviets, Durban, which was in many ways promoted by the United Nations, just coming back, and we're, despite our best efforts, and we're going to continue our best efforts to stop Durban 4 from happening. But if you had to explain something like that, in your opinion, what would you think?
Why do these ideas continue to be so prominent? Look, I mean, I think these are propagandistic ideas. They were put together by master propagandists. It's really important to understand it, because you can't defeat propaganda. I think it's very hard to defeat propaganda with reason. Propaganda, good quote unquote propaganda, is put together. If we think of propaganda is a way to influence thinking, to influence the minds, right? The best propaganda is put together in such a way as to hit you on an emotional level. And there is something that these messages are hitting on a deeply emotional level, and which is why you see so much inaccuracy, and it's almost like it doesn't matter. It's the same thing that we saw in Soviet times. Like the Soviet newspapers were notoriously, some were intentionally lying, but some were just simply inaccurate about what they said about Israel, about what they said about Jews. But it didn't matter. They knew it. They knew that by the time the fact checkers showed up, the propaganda already had its effect. The messages had their effect. And that is what makes these messages so pervasive, so easy to grasp and repeat, and dangerous. I mean, they speak to something deeply anti-Semitic, I think, for people. They are absolutely anti-Semitic, and we know it from the history of Soviet Jewry. We know how these ostensibly anti-Israel and anti-Zionist messages were, what an anti-Semitic effect they had on Soviet Jews. And by the way, the Soviet Union also argued strenuously that they were just being anti-Zionist. They were not being anti-Semitic. Even in this, the far left today is being completely unoriginal. All of this has been said and done before. And yet the Soviet Union was so completely anti-Semitic that when it was over, like 1.5 million, even more Jews left. So it's very dangerous, and we have to keep fighting it.
I mean, you talk about the fact that propaganda touches on an emotional level. Unfortunately, propaganda doesn't just stay on the pages of the newspaper. Propaganda doesn't stay online. Propaganda in 2021 and throughout the centuries leads to violence, leads to physical actions against Jews. And we're seeing a rise in this worldwide. Most recently, after Operation Guardians of the Wall, we released a report that showed that there was a massive rise in anti-Semitic incidents worldwide in the US, the UK, in South Africa. No matter where you looked, anti-Semitism was rising. And you mentioned it earlier. You keep mentioning my points, which is great. Before I ask my questions, one of the major claims and the thing that gives the get out of jail free card to the anti-Semites is, no, we're not anti-Semites. We're only anti-Zionists. And you and I both know that the two, anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, vice versa. Let's talk about that a little bit, because that get out of jail free card needs to be dealt with, because it's enough. You can't say, oh, I'm just against the state of Israel, I'm not against the Jews, while worldwide violent hate crimes are being perpetrated against Jews. Let's delve into that get out of jail free card and see if we can counter it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing where I've noticed, I think that the media really needs to start paying attention is when when we continuously fail to draw a distinction between criticism of Israel and demonization of Israel, or criticism of Zionism as an ideology versus demonization of Zionism. There is a difference. You don't call somebody who demonizes Israel a critic of Israel. These are two very different things, right? Demonization turns a country or a people into beyond the pale, right? Into an entity that's beyond the pale, that doesn't have a right to exist, that doesn't have a right to be part of the world kind of normal world relationships, and part of the universe kind of nations, right? Of part of the community of the good, as the phrase goes. So we have to understand that demonization is actually not criticism. What is criticism? Criticism is when you actually criticize specific policies, when you criticize a government for specific actions that it's taken. I would argue that Jews are the biggest critics of themselves and of Israel in that way, right? I mean, it's like in Israel, it's national sport practically to be criticizing the government, right? But that's different. There is truly nothing anti-Semitic about that. But when you are going with general phrases where there is nothing really it's like Zionism is racism. What is that supposed to mean? And how is that a criticism? It's not a criticism, it's demonization. So that's we have to kind of force the media to make that distinction and stop calling demonizers critics.
Okay. That's very true, and I think you can agree. If you're legitimate criticism will lead to dialogue, which is great. It's healthy and it's welcome. Yes. But when you, as you say, demonize and call for violence for no reason, that's the line that we want drawn. Now, everything that we talked about is going on worldwide, and history repeats itself, unfortunately. You recently released an article. In fact, it's the article that I read that led to this podcast, about the fact that second generation Jews in the US from the USSR are those taking the stand currently against anti-Semitism. So I think that's, we started this conversation with your history and your story. And I think it's a fitting way to sort of wrap up today's interview is let's talk about that for a little bit. Why do you think, second and obviously first generation Jews from the USSR are those that are standing up and are unique in their fight against anti-Semitism? Because, all Jews, we wish all Jews would stand up and fight. That's, stand up and draw that line in the sand. But there's a uniqueness that comes from second generation Jews from the USSR, and obviously a very uniqueness that comes from that generation, your parent that left. But what gives this uniqueness, and why do you think they are the ones that are really beginning to take this forefront?
Well, first of all, I want to say that Russian-speaking Jews, or RSJs as they're often called, ex-Soviet Jews, they're not a monolith. There are different groups within them, but there are in recent years, I would say, and especially in recent months, in the recent conflict, it became very apparent that there is a very strong voice, Russian-speaking Jewish voice that speaks up against the demonization of Israel, against the demonization of Zionism. And I think that the reason is it's historical in a way, because first of all, we experienced this kind of demonization ourselves. or our parents experienced it, and we know this history, and it reminds us of that time. It's not just me saying it. Practically every Jew with that background that I talk to will say, wow, this is just, it's as if, I left the Soviet Union for America, never expecting to hear that again. And here I am hearing this again here. So there is that experience, and there is less willingness to let it go. The way I think a lot of times third, fourth generation Americans just let it go because we came to America running away from it. We're not going to be silent about it here. There is also there is a sense of peoplehood that I think RSJs naturally have, and I think it's probably because of the particular way in which our identity was shaped, which was ethnically based. So it's very easy for us to understand the idea of Jewish peoplehood, that we are a people, that there has to be solidarity from, that we have to support one another. We have the history of having been supported by American Jews and Israeli Jews during the refuseniks movement. And so it's a very natural concept for us. Also, look, there are 1 million Soviet Jews who came to Israel. And so a lot of us have very close relatives, loved ones in Israel. I think probably, I don't know the statistics, but probably more so than for third or fourth generation American Jews. And so for us, Israel is not some kind of an abstract country. We also have been to Israel, I think, I'm going to guess, many more times than maybe some American Jews. And so we actually know the truth. We know what it looks like. We can call the bullshit that a lot of times comes from the far left propaganda. Excuse my language, you can edit it out if you need to. So it's a very different perspective. And I think that we can bring this perspective into the American conversation. And I think it's really important, an American Jewish conversation. And I think that there is a growing realization among kind of native-born American Jews that this group, this immigrant group, we still have this sort of immigrant fire in the belly, that we have something important to contribute. And there is a willingness also on the part of Russian-speaking Jews now to kind of join the conversation and become leaders and be part of it. And so I think for all of these reasons, that's kind of the answer to your question, I would say.
Thank you. And I always like to sum up the episodes that I lead on a positive note, but a note leading forward. And I'd like to ask you, for those that are taking this fight forward, whether it's the youth, whether it's the young leadership, whether it's the parents who are seeing what their kids are going through in schools and universities, which is just absolutely horrific. Those who want to take up the torch and help and fight back, what advice would you give based on your story, based on what you've learned, to those people that say enough is enough? And the title of this podcast is How We Fought Against. So let's end with your advice to those people.
Don't be afraid. Don't let your fear silence you. I think that that's the most important thing. Fear can really destroy your soul, I would say, and it certainly undermines your vital force. Don't let the fear, fight the fear so that you can fight the fight.
I think if I could end right there, I would. Fight the fear so that you can fight the fight is perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. For those it's our honor, our privilege. For those of you who enjoyed our podcast, you can find many, many more on all of your podcast channels. This episode, I had the honor and privilege of bringing you this story, but there are many, many other stories on our previous episodes and coming up. We look forward to hosting many, many more guests and many, many more of you on this episode, so we can continue the fight. We can fight against that fear. With knowledge comes power. Let's educate ourselves and let's stand up and be the change we want to see in the world and fight against this baseless hatred. So thank you all for joining us. Tune in again next week when we will bring you another episode of How We Fought Against.